Okay, we'll get started. Our speaker today is Jonah Lantto, and he is with the Good Talk Network and Good Talk Minot. He started those podcasting programs in 2016, and he can tell you more about the work he does as creative director and facilitating those podcasts and the other work that Good Talk Network does. The way we're going to do this is he's going to talk briefly about what it is he does, and especially the Midwest Murders podcast that he does. And I wanted to see if we could maybe do a lot of our questions by chat, because there are a number of us. You're welcome to jump in, unmute yourself and jump in with a question if you see an opportunity. But if it's hard to get a question in, feel free to use the chat. We will be monitoring that. So go ahead, Jonah.
First of all, thank you everyone for being here and for sharing some of your time with me here today and allowing me to present and talk a little bit about what it is I do. Real briefly, again, I'm Jonah Lantto. I'm the owner and founder of the Good Talk Network. It's a podcast that began in late 2016, and it was the genesis of that podcast was to be able to have really big conversations with people who had wisdom and knowledge and intelligence I did not, and allow us to have a contextualized discussion for people to listen to, disseminate that information and conversation, and decide for themselves what they'd like to think. Through a series of partnerships and me having a tenacious appetite for saying yes to those partnerships, I developed a number of other podcasts and projects underneath the Good Talk Network banner. Those include Good Talk Minot, that was a locally emphasized podcast focusing on topics in the community of Minot, community leaders, difference makers, nonprofit organizations. And over time, and again, through those partnerships, the Good Talk Network has become an audio-visual production company focusing on producing podcasts, live events, as well as commercial cinematic content. And that's really what has kind of got me here today. My biggest project that a lot of people are excited about right now is Midwest Murder. That's an endeavor that is in partnership with Dawn Palumbo. Dawn, she's an amazing and wonderful co-host, and I formerly produced another show for her. It was called After the First Glass. And Dawn and her co-host, that relationship, that podcast sort of dissolved. Dawn still had a will and desire to be on the microphone. And she said, hey, Jonah, have you ever thought about doing a true crime podcast? And the idea simmered for quite a while. I wasn't immediately interested. I didn't find a place for me right away in the world of true crime. I got into podcasting to have conversations and to share dialogue and to learn more and to share what I learned with whoever was willing to tune in. So an endeavor like Midwest Murder was much different. It's a lot more writing. It's a lot more research. It's heavier content. And it wasn't until I had a conversation with C.J. Wynn. C.J. Wynn is an author. She wrote the book Wilder Intentions. It tells the story of Angela Wilder. She was a victim of murder here in Minot, North Dakota. And CJ was a guest on my Good Talk Minot podcast. She's originally from the area. And after reading her book and having a conversation with her, it really lit the spark that began Midwest Murder. And I knew that Dawn was wanting to do a true crime. And now I'm like, well, maybe there's a place for me in the world of true crime. I'm a storyteller. I consider storytelling an art form. I'm a reasonably decent writer. Maybe I can give this a shot. And Dawn and I had a meeting, and we visited for a few hours and had a whiteboard session of what Midwest Murder would look like. And we began our project. It's been, the reception to it is grown, and we're immensely humbled by the response, and feel very rewarded that our hard work that we're putting into Midwest Murder is so well received. But additionally, I produced the late night comedy talk show Good Night Live. That was built through another series of partnerships, of saying yes, of people with big ideas coming together to take the actions necessary to make those ideas come to life. And that's a late night comedy show here in the Minot area. We've produced over a dozen shows. And really what I've learned through that is that we can put together, as a team, we can put together just about anything. We've done a roast, we've done a comedy show, we made a dating game, we're doing a game show, and it's really exciting. It's really exciting to collaborate with people who want to create and the different twists and turns that my journey has taken since I started in 2016. I never could have anticipated what has happened, but again, a key part of that was saying yes to almost anything that came up before me. I've produced more than a dozen different podcasts to varying degrees of success. I've interviewed over 300 people who are very successful people in their various creative endeavors, and it's been a really amazing ride so far. And now we're here, and Midwest Murder is touring throughout North Dakota and growing. And I'm really excited to be in this position and to see what happens next. That's me in a nutshell. I could go on for quite some time, but I'd be happy to open it up to questions or comments or thoughts, or if there's anything specifically more that you guys would like to hear about, please let me know.
So does anyone have any questions? Maybe one of the questions that you want to talk about a little bit while people are thinking about that, to make a living at this, what are some of the key things that people should be aware of if they want to go out and be a podcaster, if they want to support themselves or do it part-time?
That's a very fair question. And there are a lot of different ways to find financial success, but it doesn't necessarily come immediately. So for me in the beginning, I had time and I had preparation. I knew, okay, I've got about 6 months to a year to make this work and see if I can make money doing this. And perhaps not everybody has that. So this could start as a side hustle, but there are a number of different ways in which podcasts specifically can make money. I have really diversified what I've learned through podcasting to utilize my studio to varying levels of, financial capacity. So it's not just through podcasting that I've made money. It's through producing for others, for being a creative voice for other podcasting. I have produced, I've got an audiobook that I'm working on right now. So that is for a North Dakota author. Her book is releasing very soon. That's What We Leave Behind by Barb Solberg. So these are different ways in which I've been able to monetize my talents and my equipment. Podcasting itself, if you have a website or a hosting spot, a lot of people made, and I made money in the beginning through affiliate marketing. So I had an Amazon affiliate link that I would put to my website, and we'd make a call to action for that. And so anything that we talked about in our shows, somebody could follow our affiliate link and buy that item, and we'd get a small kickback. And even if somebody wasn't buying what we talked about, if my friends and family and people I knew were using Amazon to buy anything, well, if they went through my Amazon affiliate link, whatever money they spent, I would always get a small kickback. So that helped in the beginning. Through that, beyond that, it came through advertisers, both locally and nationally. Now it's through live events. It's through the different ways in which I'm able to utilize the studio. We've created a lot of commercial cinematic content, and now with live events. So podcasting in and of itself, you got to hit a certain level of downloads and really regional relevance, at least locally or on a wide margin, to be able to bring in advertisers. So there's not one simple answer for someone to say, hey, I'm going to be a professional podcaster. It doesn't necessarily work like that. If you are a host or somebody with a platform, say you are an author, say you have just some sort of social media following. Now there are agencies, there are podcast networks, there are more newspapers looking for creative voices to join their networks. You look at New York Times vastly expanding its digital content, specifically in the form of podcasts. So a lot of these major media networks that were formerly just paper are expanding to have a larger digital footprint, and they're recruiting talented podcast hosts. So that is another way. So there are doors always opening. But for me, I made money because I said yes to a lot of stuff. And through that, I made myself very visibly local. I was very visible. And that was I think a key part that brought more awareness to my projects and to what I can do. And now I get more opportunities like that because I've become a known commodity through growing that brand and that name.
Can you see the questions in the chat, Jonah?
I can't, but if you read them to me,
I will read them to you
that'd
then.
be awesome.
Yep. One question is, what equipment would you recommend if someone wanted to start out on a beginning scale?
It depends on what your budget is. I feel like on a beginning scale, I would advise a $500 to $1,000 budget, somewhere in there, and focus on your controllables. If you're making a podcast, focus on making the podcast great on the audio recording and on the back end editing. You can use a free program like Audacity to edit your podcast, or a lot of people, if you're familiar with other things like Adobe Audible, but I've always used Audacity in terms of the software that I use to edit and do the back end production of our podcasts. And so specific equipment, I preferred using an actual mixer with my setup. And so that a mixer is a soundboard. You know, I used to call it a soundboard. It's called a mixer, but a mixer, I had a Xenex Behringer mixer. I had MXL BCD1 mics, and the MXL BCD1 mics are incredible. Their sound quality is impeccable for their price. I think brand new, there's only about $140. So I think you're going to get a more exceptional sound quality if you're recording through a mixer. I don't record anything through software. I don't trust software for recording. You don't get as clean of a sound, and that's fine. There are a lot of successful podcasts out there that don't have the best sound, but a lot of those people had sort of a pre-existing fan base they were able to bring in, who's willing to perhaps overlook the less than stellar sound quality. So I think if for anyone starting for that $500 to $1,000, you can get several mics, a quality mixer that will interface with your computer, and then you can hard record. So I recorded everything through a digital recorder or right onto my mixer itself. And you're not relying on software. There are a lot of people who lose podcasts. They're recording using software. Their internet drops. There's a spike in the internet. They didn't press a certain button, and then you've lost all that content, or there was an interruption of your podcast. So I always liked having a hard source. I'm recording to a hard source at all times. Then I can take that file and make whatever edits I need in the program Audacity. And I've watched a ton of YouTube videos, a ton, and I'm still learning new techniques in Audacity today. What is it, 7 years later? I've been using it to edit and produce my podcast on the back end, and I'm still learning techniques that improve my sound quality. But there's a lot of easy to use tools in Audacity. You have to be willing to patiently work your way through those issues. So again, the MXL BCD1 mics, an easy mixer with a USB interface that you can plug into your computer, and then a hard recorder. And I think that's going to get you the best sound quality. You obviously are going to need people to be physically there with you in the room. And podcasts are always best if you can be with the person you're recording with in the room. I think it adds to a very potent level. We've done remote guests, but doing remote guesting that's a whole other can of worms in the podcasting world when you're doing interview-based podcasts.
Haley asks, what avenues have you used to get the word out about your podcast? Is it a lot of word of mouth?
Yeah, in the beginning, I was texting and messaging all of my family and friends basically every day. You can't just, for me, I didn't believe I could just make a podcast and politely toss it onto my Facebook and hope it worked. When we started the Good Talk, I hoped I would get 10 listeners. And fortunately, we got more, and we kept going and picked up on that momentum. But I was personally texting, personally emailing, writing individual messages to everyone I know and care about who might be interested, who would just be willing to help me give it a boost, to help me get it going. And I kept on that train. Additionally, in the beginning, I think something that was very helpful for me is I made a group for my podcast in addition to my Facebook page. And I found that through the group, there was a higher level of engagement. And I created a place, the concept of the Good Talk was always to have these organic and big time discussions, or just laugh about silly stuff. It's a little bit of both. But in the Good Talk Discussion Network, we created this group, and I found content from stuff that people would generate through there. So that became pretty key. Otherwise, it's word of mouth. It is hanging out in different, there's a lot of podcast groups on Facebook in general where you can find ways to promote it. I use Twitter. I did podcast advertising trades with other podcasts. So I would include a plug for their show on my show, and they vice versa. So most of the traditional forms of marketing, I also Minot in terms of making myself visibly locally. I went to every networking group that wanted to hear me talk about what I do, every one of them. And I joined a networking group, which was really uncomfortable for me in the beginning. I'd never done it. I thought it was a silly idea. I didn't like the idea, but I knew I wanted to get the word out there about what I'm doing. So I joined a networking group, and that comes back to saying yes to so many different things. And not all of them are going to make you money. I said yes to a ton of projects to stay visible, to keep my studio working, and to keep honing my craft and my knowledge. So in the beginning, not all of my podcasts made money. A lot of them did. And again, varying degrees of success, but I was always improving my trade, always improving my craft through that. And that's an investment in yourself that is ultimately paid off for me.
Another question comes from Heather, and she asked if you have suggestions for the best software for a person who's looking at podcasting as a hobby.
Thanks for that question, Heather. I mentioned earlier Audacity. So that's the program that I use to edit all of my podcasts. I've been using it from the beginning. It's free, and it is user driven. It's amazing. I've never had any issues whatsoever with Audacity. And for me, another big one that people use is the Adobe Audible. Adobe Audible was really strange for me to learn, and I tried to use it after coming from Audacity. It didn't work for me. So for people starting, if you're starting, you're usually going to be looking for some budget-friendly options. There's no better budget-friendly option than free, and it's Audacity. And again, the user content and tutorials for specific things that you might want to learn and do. There's a tutorial on YouTube for everything. And I recommend Audacity. Now, again, I recommend recording physically to a device. So I recorded all of my stuff originally to a digital recorder from my soundboard, from my mixer. And then I transferred the files from my digital recorder to my computer. I used a Roland digital recorder, and I think it's a key reason why our audio quality has always been pretty exceptional here. And we get a lot of compliments about it. I'm very proud of it. I've worked hard to have great audio quality. And we have fans who come up to us after our live shows at Midwest Murder and thank us. And they say, look, I can't believe you guys have better audio quality than some of the $1 million podcasts I've heard out there. And that's great. So that's my advice. Hard record, edit in Audacity. Watch some YouTube videos on what people are doing with their podcast, edit the edit out. You can, if you get, the great thing with Audacity is if you're using that and you get like a zzz, like sometimes the heater will kick on in our studio and you'd think, oh no, it's going to ruin our recording. But in Audacity, you can isolate that sound. You just record 2 seconds of that. You get the noise profile, you highlight your whole file, and then you can eliminate that zzz sound from the whole file, just like that. And it doesn't ruin the audio quality of it whatsoever. And that's some of the magic you can do with Audacity that I think if people producing podcasts took a little bit of extra time, you can make your podcast sound better than what your equipment might be if you take the time in producing it well on the back end through a program like Audacity.
There's a question about how important is original music and sound effects with a podcast.
It depends on what you're doing. That I think it's key. I think having a snappy intro is very important, but I don't know that it's going to make or break your podcast. It's not going to be the thing that defines it. It can if it's super iconic and catchy, but I don't know, like if you have a mediocre intro with excellent content, it's not going to derail it. So it really truly depends on what you're making. I did the coffee talk for a long time, and I just whipped up this really neat little, it was like a 15-second intro, and you heard coffee beans pouring into a grinder. You heard the grinder grinding the coffee beans then being dumped into the coffee, and the coffee being made. And it was all like, it was like zip, zip, zip. It was 15 seconds. And then in the end, you know, somebody has drank the coffee and they're going, ah, and you hear like a whoop little wind up, right? It's this creative, neat little thing. And I made that using all free sounds that I downloaded from there's a bunch of places where you can download some of these free sounds to create that. I do think in Midwest Murder, we worked with the Anderson family to record the intro for that. And tonally for that episode, really, really sets the tone. And I love that music. And I do believe it works well with our intro. But original music, there's a lot of places to get free music for your intro. And in terms of sound effects during your podcast, I've never worked with sound effects during the podcast. I think there's a time and a place for it. And again, it depends on the type of content you are creating. There are some like single narrative podcasts that add, maybe they're describing somebody walking in a blizzard, and they might add in some blowing wind effects. I think that's brilliant. It takes a lot of extra time to add that. And that's, you got to consider what the opportunity cost is to add those sort of sound effects into what you're doing. Now, there are more modern techniques. Like I would say, if you're getting into podcasting, spend the $600 on the new Roland Podcast Pro mixer, because you can actually program up to 8 sounds in your board. So if you want to do something like that, there's almost no easier way to do it than to have that incredible piece of device. And that's what your mics will plug into. It has Bluetooth. And I wish they had something like that out when I got started. It's even coming back to what equipment would you recommend somebody, and really, depending on your budget, it's always going to be different. But having that mixer, having a high quality mixer, will always give you the best sound content. And that Roland Pod Pro mixer, it does everything. And it's $600. Sounds like a lot, but this thing will save you so much work, and it makes everything so easy with podcasting. They made it for podcasting. So get that. It'll solve a lot of your problems. I can't hear you.
Excuse me.
Sure.
We had an incident here, but that's okay. What type of investment did you make in your physical studio space to ensure excellent sound quality?
In the beginning, I spent about $1,500 on all the equipment that I bought. That was mics, headphones, microphone cords, cables, stands. That was my mixer. That was my digital recorder, and the headphone amplifier. So it was a lot. It was everything I thought that I needed. It was I can't recall the company. Sweetwater USA, I believe they had a Podcast Pro bundle, and I didn't know anything. I spent a couple of weeks researching this. When I got into podcasting, I had a little bit of money. I knew I could invest, and I knew I had a little bit of a cushion to find out if this little dream could make any money, or I'd have to go sell cars or whatever I was going to do as my fallback plan. And I took that $1,500. I bought that podcasting package from Sweetwater. Again, it was the mixer, it was several mics, the stands, all the cabling, headphones, the headphone amplifier. Then I also got the digital recorder, so that I could physically record everything. I ended up having to upgrade my PC just a little bit back then. But now I would very much exclusively recommend to anybody getting into podcasting. I don't know. There's 2 ways to look at it. It's go big, spend $1,000 on the mixer, the Rodecaster Pro mixer, and then get the MXL BCD1 mics. And for $1,000, you're stepping into the game with exceptional sound quality right out the gates. Then you go ahead and learn how to effectively use Audacity on the back end for the little things, taking out all your ums. I don't a lot personally, but that's part of something that can be distracting in podcasts. And so when I do, if you listen to Midwest Murders, I'm not saying I get 100% of them, but I edit out ums. I edit out big breaths in Midwest Murder. Sometimes if there's a sneeze into the mic, I remove all the unpleasant sounds from all my podcasts. So for every podcast you've heard that I've made, whether it's 45 minutes or an hour and a half, I listened to that thing twice to make sure that it was done. Once when we did it live, and then again when I listen to it and I make the edits on the back end and I fix those little corrections. So having the best sound, get the mixer, get the mics. Don't try to just, I don't know. I don't want to discourage people from trying things, right? So if for somebody that wants to buy like a Yeti mic and plug it into your laptop and record yourself, that's a cool way to get more comfortable with the vocal art of podcasting. But if you want to make a good podcast, be willing to spend about $1,000 on the right equipment so that you can make a good sounding podcast.
Jonah, could you talk a little bit about your background prior to your 2016 podcast involvement? Were you involved in the communications marketing field?
I worked as a retail store manager for quite some time, and that is where I worked for Game Crazy Hollywood Video long before the digital era took over, and we ran a pretty successful store here in Minot. It was one of the more successful stores in the company, and they had what was called neighborhood marketing, and they encouraged us as store leaders to seek partnerships in the community for community related events. And that was the first big push I got, was really from a corporate idea to get more involved in your community as a store business manager, as a store leader. And that they're like, hey, yeah, you want to make an event and give away $1,000 of video game stuff, that go do it. I was like, all right, cool, I can do this. And so I started making events and gaming tournaments, and that just grew. So that really is where I think I gained a little bit of a passion and love for making events. And I was a bartender for quite a while. I sold insurance way back when. I mean, this going all the way back, right, to when I was 18. I went to school for broadcasting and communications for about a year. I probably went to school too young, wasn't quite ready for it. I dipped out after that year. And here I am. I came full circle though. In 2016, I came back to that desire to be part of the broadcasting and communications world, and I did it, I guess, in the form of podcasting. But I helped manage and run a few successful businesses, bartended, and it was sort of at the end of being a store leader and store manager. I was in that transitionary period. I was in a good spot. I didn't have a lot of debt. I was like, well, I got a little bit of money here, and I was going to either buy a drone and want to get into like the commercial drone world, or start a podcast. And I started the podcast.
Nikki has a question. Do you have a recommendation for the number of episodes to have in place when you launch a new podcast, or any recommendations on best practices for frequency of episodes?
That is a great question, because those are important determining factors. And if you're developing a fan base of people who want to listen to your content, the last thing you want to do is run out of content to give them, because podcast listeners, I won't say they can be fickle, but I know of other podcasts that were on the uptick and then had to take a break, and they lost that momentum. So depending on what your schedule is, you got to go by the schedule. I think that the length of your podcast is a good determining factor. If you have a shorter if it's 30 minutes and you and your co-host can plan out half a day, record 4 of them. And then in terms of frequency, I've done podcasts that were weekly. I've done podcasts that were bi-weekly. Weekly is challenging. It really is. If you're doing weekly, I would recommend having a good 6 to 8 stored up, because then you've got that 2-month lead. Doing the bi-weekly, at least for Midwest Murder and for some of the other podcasts that I've done, it's worked really well. In the beginning, I was so hungry to keep people's attention. I was pumping out 3 to 4 episodes a week. It was crazy. We were on the mic, and we'd be on the microphones. We'd get on the, but the thing was, it wasn't that we were together every day doing this. We would get on the microphones for 2 days, and we would just hammer out as many episodes as we could for as many ideas as we could think about, and just had fun with it. So it is important to have episodes in the backup in case something happens. So definitely have a plan, stick with your content release plan. And whether that's bi-weekly or weekly is up for you to sort of determine based on the content you're creating. One of my favorite podcasts is Snacks Daily. I listen to it every day. It's about 15 minutes every day. It's 3 quick stories, highly informational and charismatic. And I think everybody should listen to Snacks Daily. The whole world would be a better conversation piece. But they're great. But they make a podcast every day, those guys. And you can hear their editing. As somebody who also produced podcasts, their editing is exceptional. But those guys, they know each other really, really well. They're recording every day. So that's what works for them. So you got to determine, what is your podcast? What is your goal? And then kind of what frequency can I maintain beyond that? So weekly or every other week seem to be where most podcasts land. But you've got exceptions that, hey, Snacks Daily, it's 15 minutes every day. Why not do it 5 days a week?
Becky has a question. Did you do anything like focus group testing before going live?
No, none. I not for any show that I've done. I'm not saying you shouldn't, but in the beginning, we just wanted to get on the mics. We didn't, and we were just 2 dudes that felt like we had a lot of interesting ideas and topics and could get fun people to come talk with us. And that's how it got started. And even when I would bring a guest onto the show, for my guest interviews, I preferred very much for them to be organic. So I didn't provide a list of questions that I was going to ask anybody, but also offering them the understanding that this is a polite conversation. There's no gotcha moments. I'm not trying to get anybody, even if I don't agree with your viewpoints. I just want to ask you questions, allow you to talk about it and express what your ideas are, and let everybody else who's listening determine what to think of that. And that was my kind of strategy in those discussions.
We have another question. What
Sure.
are important qualities for your studio space? Do you use a room in your house, or what do you use?
I began in my house. So I had a second living room, if you will, like a downstairs in my house. And I just turned that into my podcast studio. The most important quality is quiet, is to not be interrupted, to not have any background noise. And that was it. And that your needs might change over time too. When we started out, we were just doing podcast only. We were recording and releasing, and we set a number of goals. Well, I'd love to be doing a live podcast, and I'd love to be doing a live podcast with video. And we sort of evolved that and added. So eventually we added cameras, and that's how Good Talk Minot became a live weekly Facebook show, but also the podcast that was released on the back end. And now a lot of the other podcasts I've made, some of them want to do it both ways, video and audio, some audio only. And there's advantages to both. I think sometimes it forces a divided attention between the video and the audio content. But important in a studio space, number one, controlling the environment. You can't be recording a podcast with your dog barking out the window, or your kid. It's funny, once it's like your kid pops in to ask you a question and stuff, but what are you trying to do with your podcast? In some settings that might be okay, but if you're recording a really intense story or something and you're into it, and then all of a sudden in the background, well, that doesn't work well. So controllable environment. If you want to do live, if you want to go live podcast as opposed to just recording, then lighting would be your other important aspect, something that I overlooked for many years in the basement. I didn't know anything about lighting. And then when I partnered with Adam Dias, and that was another one of the great partnerships that I said yes to, he came in and was like, all right, you got to fix the lighting in here. It's like the first thing he said. And I was like, what? I got lights? He's like, yeah, but they're all wrong. And so just kind of having a little bit of understanding about the lighting for that visual presentation, I think is really important too. And think about what does your set look like? You know, do you want fun stuff? Again, that's visual audio, very different.
We have a question from Jennifer. She asked, what is your recommendation for a hosting site? How hard is it to get on Apple? I'm assuming you would want it to be available to both iPhone and Android users.
Absolutely. That's a really good question, Jennifer. So I started out, I've used a few different podcast sites to host my podcast. So a hosting site will be the entity that syndicates your podcast so that it's made available on Apple and Spotify and Stitcher and Amazon and all the amazing places people can download podcasts. In the beginning, I used a service called Libsyn, and Libsyn was all right, and I liked it. I used them for quite a while without a lot of complaints, and then I got turned on to Buzzsprout. And Buzzsprout is who I use now, and I simply found Buzzsprout to be more efficient and more user-friendly. It came down to their user interface of actually uploading your podcast and being able to manage it. I liked the management interface with Buzzsprout a lot more than with Libsyn, and that's why I moved everything over to Buzzsprout. So it's a great question. And then in syndicating your podcast, depending on what your release schedule is and what you are, how big your files are on Buzzsprout, anywhere from $6 to like $20 a month is the cost for them to actually host your podcast. And then submitting to Apple and Spotify now, it's very simple. Once you have your podcast recorded and ready to go, like what a lot of people will do, say if you recorded like 4 or 5 episodes, take like a teaser, like a 1.5-minute teaser, or even just the intro. If you've got like a 1.5-minute long intro, you can upload that as your first episode and get people to initiate their subscription. So utilizing iTunes and Spotify, really easy, pretty user-friendly. You can just Google how to submit my podcast to iTunes. It'll walk you through the steps. But you can establish that initial following and get your fan base sort of hyped for the release of your podcast by uploading your intro or like a 2-minute teaser of your podcast before the rest of the episodes come out, right? Because you want to be able to have, when that first episode drops and you have people that are already interested in what it's going to be, then you sort of have those immediate subscribers, and it gives you that time through Buzzsprout. Once you've been approved, Buzzsprout then handles the rest of it. Once you've been approved through iTunes, you can go into Buzzsprout and more or less click through a bunch of stuff and get your podcast submitted everywhere else.
I wanted to ask you about Midwest Murders. Do you write for that? Don write for that? Where do you get the material?
For Midwest Murder, when Dawn is the primary reader and presenting, she has done the research and writing for her case. And I don't know what it's going to be. So that's part of our dynamic and part of the setup of our show, is that one person has researched and written that episode and the other does not. They're reacting as the listener, as the real-time listener. In my episodes, I research and write my episodes. I have worked with a few co-writers. I've worked with Dr. Jonah Lantto. So her and I think have written maybe 10 or so of my episodes together. What are we at? Maybe not 10. So we've written a handful, 8 to 10 of our episodes. Dr. Tangney and I have co-written and co-researched. Most recently, in our episode that just came out this week, I covered the Angela Wilder story. And as being friends and colleagues with CJ Wynn, I invited her to participate in this episode. Well, I asked her, hey man, you want to partner on this? You know all the research, you've written the book. How would you feel about writing a podcast episode and all presented on the show? So that was the first time that I have presented a story that was mostly written by someone else. CJ did the bulk of the writing, and then I took it and kind of gave it my Jonah voice to a degree, so that it fit me a little bit more fine-tuned. But when I research my episodes, my goal is to write about 15 pages of script. So I'm putting my script goals for whatever I'm presenting to be 15 pages at least. Some of them get larger, like the Mindy Morgenstern case, for example. I read it was 1,200 pages of court documents. It was a lot, and it was intense. And from those 1,200 pages, I took like 17 or so pages of notes. And then from those 17 pages of notes, I ended up writing about 20 pages of script. Now, 20 pages in the traditional, I use a larger font and stuff like that because my eyes are that way. So maybe 20 pages of Jonah script are 17 pages of traditional, whatever. But that's my goal when I'm writing. I take an abundance of notes based on the research, and then I craft a story around the notes. So there is a ton of writing, and I like to create atmosphere within the story, and I'm not writing anything that isn't there, and I don't embellish. And for some people, the details, I like an abundance of details. The feedback I've gotten from most of my listeners from my episodes are they prefer the high level of detail that I put in there. Sometimes it's gotten to be too much for people, and that's just true crime. It's not. It is sad and tragic and ugly and violent, and it's in the show. We're not going to shy away from the morbid details. So I don't embellish, but I'm not afraid to write what's there. I'm not afraid to write what a witness is seeing when they walk into a horrific scene, because I want to put listeners there.
You have recorded before live audiences. Does that change the dynamic?
Yeah. There is something that is just a little more electric with the live audience, and you're getting real-time reactions to what you're sharing. And it's for me, it's a performance art. I don't want to say performance art, but again, I think storytelling is an art form, and being able to read people and hitting. Man, I know there's stories we've told where I wasn't the only person holding back tears trying to deliver this live story, that the audience was right there with me. It's very gripping stuff. So I always liken it to sitting around a campfire in the dark and telling a scary story. And that's the vibe and the feeling and the energy that I have with telling the live story. And there although we don't intentionally design our show to be funny, there's just moments Don and I react. There's a lot of natural moments that are funny, and it creates a little bit of levity during these otherwise serious topics. And when you can share that with the audience, it's pretty meaningful. And then afterward, we have the Q&A session, and it gets us to know, it helps us get to know people and allows people to ask questions. And it's overall, it's really engaging and rewarding experience.
What advice would you have in terms of length of a podcast? I'm sure it depends on what you're podcasting on, but how do you gauge that?
A podcast should be as long as it needs to be. Period. That's the simple answer. What are you talking about? Have you made your point, or are you just droning on? And it's something that you learn a little bit more as well. The other advice I'd give to people, especially if you're going to develop an interview-based podcast, the advice I would give is don't question stack. And what that means is don't give a paragraph lead in and then ask 3 questions after your paragraph lead in to your guest. I've done it a bunch of times, and I look back on myself and I was like, Jesus, that's obnoxious. I can't believe you did that to that person. How the hell are they supposed to answer 3 questions after you barrage them with your big opening paragraph statement? So be pointed. If you're interviewing somebody, it's okay to have a nice lead in to your question, but have a question. Second thing a lot of people do, don't answer your own question before you let your guest answer your question. Happens all the time. Don't interrupt your guest, even when you're excited. That's your guest. Yes, people are here to hear you. You're the host, but people are also interested in who your guest is. So be mindful of not and again, these are all things I've been guilty of, and these are all things that I have learned, but don't stack those questions up. Don't answer the question before your guest, and don't interrupt your guest when they are asking or when they're answering your question, even if you got something exciting and relatable. So you got to remember, a dialogue is about reflection. So if you ask your guest a question, they say something thoughtful, and then you just launch into another question, you got to have that moment of reflection where maybe you reflect on what they just said, offer another comment, and then go into the question, right? The conversation, dialogue, questions, it's an art form. And you get there through making a lot of mistakes and doing it the wrong way a lot of the time. But those are for interviews. Highly recommend those aspects. And again, how long does a podcast need to be? It's how long should it be? It's how long does it need to be? What points do you want to make? Have you made them? Can you make them? Then yes, then stop blathering about it. Sometimes you might know, hey, we did an argument. It was the entertaining show of argumentative debate. Convince me otherwise. It was 30 minutes. That's it. We knew. There was a buzzer. We had a little buzzer. It was a 30-minute show. That's what we knew it was going to be. Midwest Murder. My episodes tend to go a little bit longer than Dawn's. So you might get a 45-minute episode from a Dawn episode. I have some of my stuff has gone an hour and 50 minutes. One of mine went, and that was how long it needed to be. I wasn't going to cut my story because I was trying to force it into this time frame. So again, very much depending on what you're doing. Snacks Daily, they're 15 to 18 minutes every day because it's 3 stories. They know they got to get through them. Boom, 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 boom. But in a true crime story, this is all scripted. How long does it need to be? What details are important? How can you enhance the story with your writing without? It's not an embellishment. It's not just adding something to add something. I think the other thing for me with true crime is minimal banter. A little bit of banter is okay, but and some shows are major banter, and people like that too. For my preference, minimal banter. So a podcast should be as long as it needs to be.
Becky has another question. Can you see data that shows how long listeners stay on the podcast, and do you lose some over time?
Absolutely. You see all the data. The tracking in terms of retention as well as location is excellent, and we're not seeing a loss in our download data at all. So, but yeah, Buzzsprout or Libsyn, both. A lot of people still prefer Libsyn for varying reasons. I'm not saying one or the other is better. I've used both. I would recommend both based on what your preference between the two is in using their functionality. I'm using Buzzsprout now, and their data and analytics is pretty excellent. They have just about everything you'd want them to have.
I don't see any other questions in the chat right now, so I wanted to ask if you would talk just a few minutes about podcasting in general and the industry of podcasting. Are you seeing more people interested in it, not just putting out, but willing to listen to it? And if somebody's interested in doing this either as a hobby or for their business, are there going to be people out there listening? Is there more interest in that?
Absolutely. Podcasting is the fastest growing content medium in the US. It's not going away. The number of podcast listeners has continuously grown for 12 consecutive years. Now, the contrast to that is there are now more podcasts out there than ever before. So it creates a larger challenge in getting the people to listen to what you're making. Chances are most of your friends have a couple of favorite podcasts. People that they're listening to, that they got to make time for. So it can be a very saturated market, but there is a big market nonetheless. And I'm a firm believer, if you work hard at creating your content, control your controllables, your sound quality and your content. You can control those two things. You can't control how people respond to what you do, but you can control the quality of what it is, how it sounds, and how you sound on the mic, and what you're saying into the microphone. And after that, the rest is all luck and marketing. It's just really trying to get it out there. Can you get news interviews, and who can you talk to, and where? And how many places are you willing to go where you might not be super comfortable, but you want to tell people about your podcast, or you want to get in front of people? And that's a key part of it. So I see more people than ever before are finding ways to engage with podcasts. And as I've said, now you have major media organizations who are going out of their way to recruit, hire, and develop podcast hosts. It's NPR, it's New York Times, it's anybody who wants to stay relevant. New York Times just signed one of the most landmark podcast deals last year. I know that the Joe Rogan Spotify deal pretty big, and Spotify has also paid a lot of podcast hosts for exclusivity, but they're not the only ones doing it. It's everywhere. So if you can build a following one way or the other, there's opportunity out there. And even if you're not getting bought out by some big organization that's willing to pay you to produce a podcast for them, it doesn't mean there aren't other opportunities. Again, for me, I found that I can financially be successful by utilizing my studio. There are a lot of people who want to develop a podcast that don't have the equipment, that don't have the knowledge, that don't want to buy the equipment or develop the knowledge, but they sure as heck want to get on a microphone. Well, I have a turnkey solution for that. So I can make money as a producer on the back end, and that's become pretty valuable. Or people who want to use the studio for voice recordings, things like that. So there are these other aspects. How many ways can you diversify your equipment and your knowledge base to be successful? People will always be listening to podcasts. I had a friend of mine who questioned my investment of time in the Midwestern. Like, well, aren't you worried that people will stop listening? And I said, well, I don't know. Are you going to wake up tomorrow and Dave Matthews isn't going to be your favorite band anymore? No? Okay, then people are going to just wake up tomorrow and suddenly stop being Midwest Murder fans, or stop wanting to listen to true crime. Like we're out there, we're working hard at this, and it's growing. So I think, like, if you're making a podcast, people like it, and you're consistent, and you're giving people value, that's not going to go away. And again, more and more people will be listening to podcasts every year. And more platforms are now looking for ways to get their podcasts in your home. They want to give you podcasts through your Amazon app, through your smart TV. They want to plug podcasts right into your stereo console in your car. So yeah, radio's here too, but podcasts are experiencing exponential growth year after year.
Since you can't see the chat, I'm going to tell you what Jennifer wrote. She said, I love podcasts. I'm a chronic multitasker. And if I can learn something new on my boring drive to work, yay. If I can be entertained while doing dishes, woohoo. You need time to concentrate in order to watch videos. So audio is a win for me.
I'm with you, Jennifer. You sound like somebody who would love Snacks Daily. Give them a try. See if you like those guys. They're pretty fantastic.
Mm-hmm. Well, we're about out of time, and we didn't get a chance to do this at the beginning. So I'm going to ask our participants, before you click leave, if you want to just come on and introduce yourself, your name, who you're with. So Jonah has an idea who he was speaking to today. Thanks.
I'd say, again, thank you to all of you for sharing your time with me here today. It's really fun to be able to share what I do with you guys.
I can jump in. I'm Jenna Pierce. I'm with the UND Center for Rural Health, not a North Dakota professional communicator yet, but just looked up the website, plan on joining. So thank you for doing this, Jonah. That was fascinating.
Thank you.
I can't figure out how to get my video on, so I'm sorry. This is Jennifer, and I thought this was just such a timely thing for us. So thank you so much, Jill, for sharing this. I'm hoping to get one started for the DEQ. We just have so many different topics to share with people, and such great information. And so I feel like I'm kind of drowning on this topic, and I just appreciated all the recommendations for equipment and hosting sites. And eventually we're going to get this going. I was just scoping out like a empty janitor closet or something I could stick a table and a couple chairs in today. So crossing my fingers. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Hey, that's where it's got to start. I hope now you're not drowning anymore. Maybe I tossed you a little life vest over there.
Hi, I'm Becky Koch. I spent 30 years at NDSU Agriculture Communication and am semi-retired in Arizona now, though, but I teach a class remotely for NDSU. So I certainly plan on sharing some of this with my students, although they probably know more about podcasts than I do.
I'm Nikki Mossman. I'm the Communications Director at the Energy and Environmental Research Center at the University of North Dakota. Thanks for your time today. It was really interesting and helpful. We've been talking with my team for about a year now as to whether or not we have the staffing to create a podcast, but also sustain a podcast. So that's why my questions were pointed about content and how much you should have at the beginning and how often to publish. So thank you. I appreciate your time.
You're welcome. Thank you. Good questions.
I'm Sabrina Herman, and I know Jonah because I love to. Hi, Jonah. I am
Hi,
a
Sabrina.
huge fan. He is well aware I'm a huge fan. But some of I think your background information was great. I've also said to them that I think it'd be, when you look at podcasts, it's interesting on how you can advertise and get different messages across to for businesses, which is something we're looking at in my current employer. So I think that's an interesting way to look at this. I also love that we talked a lot about audio versus video, and I love the audio part. And I'm sure it's hard for you guys to maybe have guest speakers, but I always say I would love to be a guest researcher for the Midwest podcast group. Like, how great would that be? That like you could be the one helping them kind of dig through files and figure something out. So yeah, but thanks so much, Jonah. Great information, even more than I knew about just how much I love to listen. So thank you.
I thank you, Sabrina. And I would add one point to that, since it didn't come up during the discussion. In terms of advertising, there is a ton of data that indicates podcast listeners very loyal and much more likely to engage in purchase-based behavior based on the loyalties and what their favorite podcast host is listening to at a much higher rate than other advertising mediums. So it's an important thing to point out, at least for podcasts who have a following, their listeners are rather likely to at least be curious, perhaps more so than just a radio ad in the background.
Okay. Well, that looks like it wraps things up for us. It is after 1 o'clock, so we appreciate your time so much, and I'm glad that we could get this to work out. And like I said, it makes a big difference to our members to hear from somebody who's actually doing these things and can give them some good advice. So I appreciate that, and I will end the meeting then.
I appreciate you guys. Thank you.